The first time I held that letter in my hands, my heart felt like it had stopped. The envelope was thin, but heavy in meaning. The kind of weight that does not come from paper, but from betrayal. My name was printed on the top, bold and cold. A legal notice. The word said I had 30 days to vacate my own house. For a moment, I could not move. My legs froze, and a quiet ringing filled my ears. The world outside my window looked the same, neighbors walking their dogs, children playing, but everything inside me had collapsed. This was my home. The walls that had seen my laughter, my grief, my entire life. I had paid every tax, every bill. I had planted each tree in the yard with my own hands. How could someone claim it did not belong to me? That night, I could not sleep. Every sound felt like an echo of betrayal. My mind ran through faces, friends, relatives, people I trusted. Who would do this? Who would want me gone? I remembered the last conversation with someone I once called family. Their words had been soft, but their eyes were calculating. They had said, "It is just a formality, sign it and you will be safe." I had signed, unaware that my signature had already started the war against me. In the morning, I sat in the kitchen staring at the letter again. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the shock of realizing how blind I had been. I walked through every room slowly, touching the furniture, the walls, the windows. I whispered to myself, "They cannot take this from me." When I called the lawyer listed on the notice, the tone of his voice told me everything before he spoke. He said, "You may need to prepare yourself. The case looks strong on their side." Their side. That phrase burned. I had never imagined my own family would stand on the other side of that line. Later that day, I visited the property office. The clerk pulled out the file, flipped through a few pages, and looked at me with hesitation. My signature was there, on a transfer agreement I had never seen before. My stomach twisted. Someone had copied my handwriting perfectly. I left the office with shaking hands. The world outside looked brighter than usual, almost mocking me. People passed by, smiling, unaware that my entire life had been stolen with ink. That evening, I sat alone on the porch. The house looked peaceful under the fading sun, but peace felt like a stranger now. I could not cry. I could only think. There had to be a way to fight back. I just did not know how yet. The next morning, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end said something that froze my blood. "You can avoid the court if you cooperate. Sign over the property officially, and we can settle quietly." I hung up without speaking. My silence was the only control I had left. For the first time in years, I felt something rise inside me that was stronger than fear. Anger. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that plans. I started writing everything down, dates, names, calls, every memory that seemed suspicious. I needed proof, something solid that would turn this nightmare around. The following day, I met an old friend, someone who once worked in law enforcement. After hearing my story, they leaned closer and said, "You are not fighting people, you are fighting greed." But greed always leaves fingerprints. Those words became my lifeline. That night, I went through old documents, old recordings, and even security footage I had forgotten existed. Each folder felt like a door to the past, opening to reveal something I had missed. At midnight, I found it. A copy of a conversation recorded by accident. One of the people behind this scheme was discussing how they planned to use my trust against me. My hands were shaking as I replayed that clip. The voice was familiar, painfully so. Someone who had shared my table, my food, my stories. It felt like a knife turning in my chest. But that pain also gave me strength. I realized the story was not over. It was only beginning. Over the next few days, I noticed strange cars parked near my house. I knew they were watching, waiting for me to break. I stopped answering unknown calls. I stopped opening the door at night. Every move became careful, deliberate. I started meeting lawyers, one after another, trying to find someone who believed me. Most of them smiled politely and said the same thing, "Without direct proof, you cannot win." But I had proof. They just did not know it yet. A week later, I walked into the courtroom for the first time. The smell of polished wood and old files filled the air. My knees wanted to give up, but I kept walking. Across the room, I saw them, the same people who had once hugged me at family dinners. Their eyes avoided mine. When the judge called my name, I stood up. My voice did not shake. I said, "I am here to fight for what is mine." Every person turned to look at me. In that moment, I realized something powerful. Fear only wins if you let it. I walked out of that hearing knowing that the war had begun. They thought they had already won, but they had underestimated one thing. I may have been silent before, but now I had nothing left to lose. And when a person loses everything, they become unstoppable. As I closed the door behind me that day, I whispered to myself, "They will remember this fight." The storm was coming, and this time, I would be the one to start it. It started years before that letter arrived. At the time, I did not notice the cracks forming. I thought I was surrounded by care, by people who wanted the best for me. I was wrong. They were patient. They built trust like a trap, one brick at a time. Back then, life felt steady. The house was more than walls to me. It was my anchor. Every room carried the story of my years, the photos on the wall, the small scratches on the doorframe, even the scent of old wood after rain. I had spent decades keeping it alive. I never imagined someone I loved would try to steal it. It began with small favors. A signature here, a shared account there. They said, "We will handle the bills for you. You have done enough. Let us take care of things." I wanted to believe them. After all, trust does not vanish overnight. It fades, quietly. Looking back, I can see every warning sign. The calls that were cut short when I entered the room. The missing letters. The way they always diverted the topic whenever property papers were mentioned. Still, I ignored it. I told myself I was being paranoid. People who love you do not plot behind your back, right? Months passed. Then came the investment pitch. They said we could use the house as collateral for a small business. Nothing risky, just paperwork to access funds temporarily. I remember sitting at the dining table, staring at the documents, my instincts whispering that something was off. But they smiled, reassuringly. They used the kind of warmth that disarms you. I signed. That signature became my biggest regret. Soon after, I noticed changes. They started treating me like a guest in my own home. I heard whispers about ownership, about future plans. When I asked, they laughed and said I was overthinking. Yet, their tone was different. Their words felt rehearsed, polite but cold. One evening, I overheard a conversation through the half-open door. My name, the house, and something about transferring the title soon. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I froze, unable to step inside or confront them. I waited until they left, then stood in the empty hallway, feeling like a stranger inside my own life. The next day, they acted as if nothing had happened. They smiled, made tea, and spoke about the weather. I wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, but the silence between us had changed. They started keeping records locked, avoiding eye contact, and making decisions without asking me. It was not just about property anymore. It was psychological. They wanted me to doubt my own memory, to think I was imagining things. When I questioned a missing document, they said I must have misplaced it. When I mentioned the strange phone calls, they said I was confused. Their calm tone made me question myself. I began writing notes secretly, every conversation, every date, every word. I hid them inside old photo frames, between books, under the mattress. I felt paranoid, but something deep inside told me that truth always needs evidence. Then came the day they introduced a new lawyer, someone they said was helping the family. He spoke gently, used legal terms I barely understood, and reassured me that everything was safe. He said I only needed to acknowledge a form for clarity in ownership records. It sounded harmless. I remember the pen trembling in my hand as I signed. They all smiled, but the air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. That was the day I unknowingly handed them the weapon they would later use against me. After that, they distanced themselves. Fewer calls. Short visits. I noticed how they avoided discussing anything financial. I sensed it, but denial is powerful. You tell yourself the people you love could never do this. Until one morning, a friend stopped by. He looked worried. He told me he overheard something in the market, rumors about my house being sold to cover family debts. I laughed it off at first, but the fear lingered. I went straight to the property office. They said there was a file update pending my final consent. My name was still on it, but another name had appeared beside mine. That was the moment I knew I was being replaced. I confronted them that night. The conversation exploded. Their voices rose, and their eyes turned sharp. They accused me of not trusting them, of being ungrateful. I remember standing there, my heart breaking, as they stormed out. The silence afterward was unbearable. It was not just betrayal, it was erasure. In the weeks that followed, I tried to fix things quietly. I contacted lawyers, searched for proof, asked old acquaintances for advice. Most said the same thing: once the papers are signed, the fight becomes long and painful. But pain no longer scared me. Losing my dignity did. I started noticing how deep their deception went. Calls I never made appeared on my records. Transactions I never approved. Someone had been building a case against me long before I even realized there was a battle coming. It was a slow poisoning of trust. The final blow came when I received an official letter claiming I had willingly transferred ownership months ago. My hands went numb. The signature looked like mine, perfectly replicated. That was the day my old life ended. I remember sitting by the window, staring at the garden. The air smelled of rain. The trees I had planted decades ago stood strong, unaware of the chaos surrounding them. I realized something profound: People can take your money, your comfort, even your peace, but they cannot take your truth unless you let them. That night, I made a promise to myself. I would not let this end with silence. They thought I would collapse. They thought age made me weak. They forgot that time also makes you wise. When I lay down to sleep, I repeated one sentence again and again: they have my signature, but I still have my voice. And that voice was about to become their greatest problem. After that night, silence became my shadow. I could feel the distance growing between me and the people who once filled my home with noise. But I was not ready for how deep their plan ran. They did not just want my house. They wanted control over every corner of my life. It began subtly. I started receiving bills I had never seen before. Property tax, maintenance charges, repairs I never requested. When I asked about them, they said, "It is easier if we handle the finances now." Their tone was gentle, but their eyes were sharp. I noticed how they spoke to me like I was a burden instead of a parent. They treated my caution as confusion, my questions as weakness. They began moving money out of joint accounts under the excuse of covering costs. Every transaction was small, almost invisible on its own, but together they formed a silent theft. My trust became the very weapon they used against me. Then came the emotional guilt. They reminded me of everything I had done wrong in the past, real or imagined. They said I owed it to them to let go, to make things easier. They used words like sacrifice, as if my entire life had not already been built on it. I found myself apologizing for things I never did, just to keep peace in the house that no longer felt like mine. Every day felt like walking on glass. The smallest disagreement turned into an accusation that I was ungrateful, paranoid, or selfish. They were experts at making me question myself. They made manipulation look like love. Weeks passed, and the pressure increased. The lawyer they had introduced earlier began visiting again. He brought new documents, claiming they were updates required by the local council. I read the pages carefully this time. They looked harmless, mostly administrative jargon, but my instinct screamed not to sign. When I refused, his smile faded. He said, "Without cooperation, you might lose more than the house." Those words stayed with me long after he left. Lose more than the house. What else could they take? I started checking my accounts daily. One morning, I saw a withdrawal I did not recognize, large enough to cause panic. When I asked, they said it was a temporary adjustment. My voice cracked when I said, "You have no right." They laughed and said, "You gave us full access. It is all in writing." That was the moment I realized they had built a perfect cage. Every piece of paper I had signed over the years had quietly handed them another key. But I still had something they did not: awareness. The moment I saw the full picture, something inside me changed. Fear turned into focus. I started collecting evidence quietly. Copies of bank statements, emails, messages. I photographed every document that crossed my table. I knew they were watching me, but I also knew the only way to win was to stay silent until I was ready to strike. Then came the night they pushed too far. I overheard them arguing in the living room about selling the property before the market dropped. One of them said, "We need the signature authenticated fast. Once it is done, we can move out before the old one notices." They called me, the old one. The words cut deeper than any betrayal. I stayed in my room, listening, memorizing every detail. My hands were cold, but my mind was clear. That conversation confirmed everything. They were not going to stop until I was out on the street. The next day, I confronted them. I asked directly, "Did you plan to sell this house without my consent?" Their reaction was theatrical. Shocked faces, denial, and then the inevitable blame. "You misunderstood. We are trying to protect you from debt." I wanted to believe it, but the lies were wearing thin. When they realized I was no longer compliant, their kindness disappeared. They stopped speaking to me except through messages. They locked away documents I once had free access to. They told neighbors that I was becoming forgetful. I could feel them rewriting my story in the eyes of everyone around me. That broke something inside me. But instead of collapsing, I began to plan. I reached out to an independent attorney, someone outside their circle. She listened quietly as I explained everything. After a long pause, she said, "They are building a case that you are unfit to manage your property. If they succeed, the court could hand over control to them permanently." I felt my pulse in my throat. Unfit? They were not only trying to steal my house, they were trying to erase my authority over my own life. That night, I sat in the kitchen with the lights off, staring at the reflection in the window. I looked older than I remembered. Tired. But there was something else too. A spark I thought I had lost. I whispered, "You wanted control. You are about to see what happens when I fight for mine." Over the next few weeks, I built my defense quietly. I opened a separate account. I gathered witnesses. I printed records. Every move I made was hidden behind the mask of routine. They thought I was defeated. I let them believe it. Then one evening, I received a call from a bank officer who said, there was an attempt to transfer your property funds. The request was denied because the signature did not match perfectly. My heart pounded as I thanked him. That small imperfection had saved me, for now. But it also revealed that the fraud was deeper than I imagined. Someone was forging my signature again and again, trying to make it match perfectly. The next morning, I walked into their lawyer's office without notice. His smile faltered when he saw me. I placed my hand on the table and said calmly, "Tell them I know." He did not respond, but I could see the fear flash in his eyes. When I left, I felt the shift. The game was changing. I was no longer the target, they were. That evening, I locked every drawer, collected every key, and placed them in a small box. I looked around my home, every wall whispering stories of strength and memory. I said aloud, "You chose war. I accept." I knew the next move would come from them, but this time, I was ready. And deep down, I sensed something bigger was waiting behind the curtain. Something that would turn this quiet conflict into a storm that would shake every foundation they thought they controlled. The trap they built was about to close on them. The day I walked into the courtroom for the first time, I felt like I was walking into a war disguised in silence. The air was heavy with whispers and the faint rustle of papers. Every sound felt sharp, every look weighed a little more than it should. I had never been in a courtroom before, yet something deep inside me knew this was not their arena, it was mine. The judge entered, and the room fell quiet. My name was called. When I stood up, I could feel dozens of eyes watching me, some with pity, others with hidden satisfaction. Across the aisle, the people who had once called me family avoided my gaze. Their lawyer stood tall, confident, already convinced that this was going to be easy. He spoke first. His tone was calm but practiced. He said I had willingly transferred the house, that I had acted under sound judgment, and that I was now refusing to cooperate out of confusion. Confusion. That word hit me like a slap. They were not just trying to steal my home, they were trying to steal my sanity. I stood quietly, letting him speak. Every lie came out polished, rehearsed, smooth. He used words like agreement, consent, voluntary, trust. I could feel my fists clenching behind the table. When it was my turn, I took a breath that felt heavier than air. I looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, I may be old, but I am not confused. My mistake was not ignorance. It was trust. And that trust has been used as a weapon." The courtroom went silent. Even their lawyer paused. I pulled out the copies I had gathered over the past months, bank records, messages, dates, and the forged signatures that bore tiny differences invisible to the untrained eye. As I placed them one by one on the desk, I saw their faces shift. For the first time, they looked uncertain. The judge leaned forward, scanning the documents. I could feel the tension rising like smoke in the room. Their lawyer tried to interrupt, saying the evidence was incomplete, but the judge raised a hand and told him to wait. Then he looked at me and asked, "Why did you sign the documents if you suspected foul play?" I swallowed hard. The truth was painful to say, but it had to be said. "Because they were my family," I replied. "Because love makes you blind until the world forces you to see." The judge said nothing, just nodded slowly and turned back to the papers. Across the room, their lawyer whispered something to them, probably telling them to stay calm. But I could see the panic behind their eyes. Then came the moment I was not prepared for. Their lawyer asked permission to call a witness, someone who could confirm my mental instability. When the name was read out loud, my stomach dropped. It was a neighbor, someone I had known for years, someone who used to greet me every morning with kindness. The bailiff opened the side door, and there they were, hesitant, avoiding my gaze. Under oath, they said things that pierced deeper than any knife. That I had become forgetful. That I sometimes misplaced things. That I once mentioned feeling lost. Every word twisted my image into a shadow of doubt. I realized then that my enemies were not only inside my home, they were in my street, in my routine, in the whispers that built the narrative against me. The lawyer smiled as if victory was near. I kept my head still, my expression unreadable. When the judge asked if I wished to respond, I stood again. "People remember what they are told to remember," I said softly. "Fear makes witnesses forget kindness. But I have proof that speaks louder than memory." I placed one last document on the desk, the recording transcript of that accidental conversation I had found weeks earlier. The lawyer tried to object, but it was too late. The judge ordered the playback. The courtroom filled with voices, theirs. Cold, deliberate words about finishing the transfer before the old one notices. The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. The lawyer's face drained of color. They whispered urgently to each other, but no one dared to speak up. When the judge looked up, his expression had changed. He said the case would remain open for deeper investigation and that no property transfer would be allowed until further notice. It was not victory, but it was the first crack in their wall. As I walked out of the courtroom, my legs trembled, not from fear, but from the release of holding everything in for so long. Outside, reporters waited for another case, but some turned their cameras toward me. They saw someone standing alone, calm but unbroken. They did not know the years that had led to that moment. When I reached the steps outside, one of them called out, "What will you do now?" I looked at them and said, what I should have done from the beginning, fight without mercy, but without hate. Later that evening, I returned home. The house felt different, still mine, but touched by the war that had begun inside it. I walked through the hallway slowly, touching the wall where old family photos once hung. I whispered to myself, they wanted to prove I was weak. Today, they saw how wrong they were. That night, I could not sleep, but I was not restless. I was planning. I knew they would not stop. They would try again. They would look for loopholes, for people to buy silence, for new lies to weave. But now, I had a strategy. I started making copies of everything. I visited old contacts, people who knew me for decades, teachers, colleagues, old friends. I gathered written statements, proof of my mental and physical clarity. If they wanted a war of documents, I would give them one. The next week, I received another envelope. Same tone, same handwriting. Another attempt at intimidation. I smiled as I tore it open. It said they were filing for emergency possession based on potential risk. But this time, I was ready. My lawyer filed a counterclaim before they could even finish the paperwork. The expression on their faces when they received the notice was priceless. For the first time, they realized the trap had reversed. The courtroom had become a mirror, and they were now seeing themselves clearly for the first time. And deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. They had underestimated what a person becomes when they are stripped of everything except their will. And my will was the one thing they could never forge. The next blow came from the one person I trusted without question. It did not arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived with a quiet knock, a soft greeting, and a folder held close to the chest like a secret. I had shared meals with this person. I had shared grief and laughter. I had placed years of faith in their hands. I thought they were my last steady branch in a storm. I was wrong. They sat at my kitchen table and spoke in a careful tone, almost tender. They said the court pressure was growing. They said a temporary solution would keep the house safe while things settled. They pushed the folder toward me, not too fast, not too slow. I stared at the cover. A single page peeked out, crisp and white, full of neat lines and small traps. They said it was a protective trust. They said it was for my benefit. They said I could rest if I signed. I did not touch the pen. I looked at their face the way a person looks at a familiar room after a long absence and sees the missing pieces. Something was off. The careful pauses. The measured breath. The eyes that did not hold mine for more than a heartbeat. I asked to read every word alone. They smiled and nodded, then stepped outside to take a call. The door clicked shut with a softness that felt like a warning. I read the document slowly, line by line. The structure was clever. On the surface, it said protection. Underneath, it said transfer of control. A clause near the end changed the trustee on a trigger that looked harmless. Another clause allowed emergency management without notice. The final page required my signature and a witness. I recognized the witness name. It was the same neighbor who had stood in court and said I was forgetful. I closed the folder and pressed my palm against it. The kitchen felt smaller, the air heavier. The sound of the ticking clock pressed against my nerves. Outside, I heard a laugh that did not belong to safety. It belonged to calculation. I opened the door and asked them to come back in. I placed the folder between us and said in a steady voice, "You brought this to help me?" They nodded. I asked who drafted it. They said a friend. I asked which friend. They said it did not matter. I held their gaze and repeated the question. After a long pause, they gave a name. It was the same lawyer who had smiled through lies in court. A match dropped in my chest. Heat rose, not as rage, but as clarity. I said I wanted a second opinion. Their expression tightened for a breath, then softened again. They said delays could be risky. They said I should not wait. They said they were worried about my peace of mind. I let the silence sit between us. Some truths become loud only when no one speaks. I told them I would call my attorney. They placed a hand on mine and whispered, "You do not need an attorney for family." The sentence cut me in a place I did not know still bled. I pulled my hand back and stood. My chair's legs scraped the floor with a sound that felt like an alarm. I said I would not sign. Their face changed. The warmth fell away like a mask cut loose. The eyes that had once looked at me with care turned sharp. They gathered the folder, slid it into their bag, and stood without a word. At the door, they paused and said something soft, almost sweet, but edged like glass. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be." After they left, the house was too quiet. I walked to the window and watched them speak to someone waiting by the gate. The folder moved from one hand to another, then back again. I did not look away. When they noticed me watching, they raised a hand and gave a half-smile that did not reach the eyes. Then they left. I called my attorney and read out the key clauses I could remember. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she exhaled slowly and said, "That document shifts your authority without using the word transfer. It is a funnel that looks like a cup. If you had signed, you would have kept the illusion of control while losing the substance." I felt both sick and steady at the same time. The ground under me tilted, then locked back into place. That night, I searched every drawer, every file, every box for the older documents I had signed the year before. I laid them across the table, page after page, a map of my mistakes. Patterns emerged. The same names, the same witness, the same phrases that moved power without announcing it. My pen stroke stared back at me like a row of open doors. I traced them with a fingertip that did not shake this time. I spoke aloud to the empty room. "You taught me how to read you." The days that followed brought silence from the person who had visited me. No calls, no messages. I knew what that meant. They were meeting. They were rewriting. They were planning a new angle. I tightened my own lines. I set alerts on my accounts. I notified the bank that no changes could be made without in-person verification. I filed a request for a handwriting examiner to review the alleged past transfers. I requested the court to freeze any title changes until expert findings were complete. Then the surprise arrived. A small box on my doorstep with no return label. Inside, a single flash drive and a note that said, "You did not hear this from me." The handwriting looked unfamiliar. The fear looked familiar. I shut the door, checked every window, then plugged the drive into a device with no personal data. A single audio file sat in the folder. I pressed play. Voices. The same familiar ones. Calm, flat, practical. They discussed timelines, witnesses, and how to manage me through concern. They debated whether the next push should be made with affection or pressure. A sentence settled over me like frost. "After the trust is done, handle the sale through the cousin. The old one will not fight a blood relation." Another voice replied, "The old one will fight if cornered. Push slowly. Keep the mask on." I listened twice, 3 times. I saved the file in 2 separate devices and locked them away. Fear tried to rise, but it did not get far. I felt something different take its place. Control. Not over them, but over me. The next morning, I sent a certified notice to the court with the new evidence. I informed my attorney and requested an emergency hearing. Then I called the person who had brought the folder. I asked them to come over for tea. My voice did not shake. They arrived with a smile and empty hands. I served tea in the cups we used on holidays. Old habits felt like props on a stage I no longer recognized. I thanked them for caring. I thanked them for the years we had shared. I thanked them for the moment at the table with the folder. They blinked, unsure where I was going. I said there was something I needed to play for them. I set the device on the table and pressed the file. The room filled with their plan, sterile and tidy. They did not look at me. They stared at the wall as if meaning lived there. When the file ended, I did not speak. I let silence settle like dust. They placed the cup down carefully, hands steady through effort, not peace. Then they said the line I had been waiting for, "You were never meant to hear that." Truth arrived like a shard of light through old glass. I asked why. They said it was complicated. I said that was a word people used when they wanted to hide a simple fact. They said debts had pressed them. They said promises had trapped them. They said they had not wanted to hurt me. I said hurt does not ask for intent. I asked one final question. Did you ever plan to stop? They did not answer. Their silence told me everything I needed. The answer was no. I stood and walked to the sink, not to escape, but to give them a chance to leave with whatever grace they had left. They stood slowly, adjusted their bag, and asked if we could move on from this. I said moving on was not a door that opens from the outside. They left without another word. I locked the door and leaned against it. Tears came, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. They did not last long. Grief had done its work. It had cleared space for resolve. The emergency hearing was set the following week. The judge listened to the audio file, paused it twice, and asked precise questions. He placed a stay on all property actions and ordered full discovery. The other side tried to object. Their voices were measured, but their eyes flickered. The person I had trusted most did not meet my gaze. I did not force it. I looked at the judge, at the file, at my attorney. My life had taught me where to spend attention when truth was on the line. Outside the courthouse, I stood on the steps and let the wind cool my face. Reporters passed by to chase a louder case. That suited me. I did not need noise. I needed progress. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number arrived. you think you won. You paused it. You did not stop it. I stared at the words until they lost meaning. Then I deleted them and increased the security on everything I own. That night, I walked through each room of my house and spoke to it the way people speak to the past when they are ready to face it. I said, they thought you were the prize. They forgot you are also the witness. I placed fresh batteries in the devices that watched the doors. I moved the most vital papers to a safe deposit box. I wrote down a list of names who would never again cross my threshold. I sat at the table where the folder had rested and opened a blank notebook. I gave the next phase a title that I would never speak aloud, Proof of Intent. I drew 3 columns, who, what, when. Under who, I wrote the name of the person who had once been my shelter. Under what, I wrote the words that had tried to end me. Under when, I wrote the date of the hearing that would show the court what loyalty looks like when it is hungry. I closed the notebook and watched the night settle against the glass. Somewhere beyond the street, engines hummed, plans shifted, calls were made. I did not chase any of it. I stayed still. I listened to the quiet. I let my breath slow until the room felt like a map I could read in the dark. They had taken my trust and turned it into a weapon. I had taken their weapon and turned it into a record. The house stood, the case held, the lines tightened. I knew there would be another move. There always is. When it came, I would be ready to answer with something they did not expect. I would be ready to show the court what love looks like when it refuses to be used. I would be ready to become the person they had been counting on me never to become. After the hearing, the days felt longer. The court had frozen every move they could make, yet I knew they were not done. People like that never stop. They just wait for the next shadow to hide behind. I had proof. But proof is not safety. Proof only buys time. I spent those weeks inside the house, keeping lights low, learning the rhythm of my own walls again. Every creak meant something. Every silence felt like a test. The betrayal from someone so close still pressed against my chest, but it had changed shape. It no longer hurt in the same way. It had become fuel. One afternoon, I received a call from my attorney. She said the handwriting examiner had finished a preliminary review. The findings were clear. The transfer documents were forged. The strokes looked identical but carried pressure patterns that no machine could hide. Relief washed through me, cold and sharp. It was proof that could cut through every lie. But she also warned me. They will not admit defeat. Expect counterclaims. Expect noise. Noise came sooner than I expected. Anonymous messages started arriving again, each one colder than the last. One said I should withdraw the complaint, for my health. Another said accidents happen. I printed each one, placed them in a folder, and filed a report. I knew fear was their language, silence was mine. The following week, I returned to court for a procedural update. Their lawyer looked tired, not defeated, but fraying at the edges. I could sense the shift. When power begins to slip, people start turning on each other. I saw it in their glances, the way they avoided eye contact, the whispered blame. The judge scheduled the next hearing for full evidence presentation. That meant every document, every recording, every word would now be official record. It was a victory. Small but real. I left the building feeling lighter than I had in months. That night, I sat in the living room surrounded by files, sticky notes, and marked pages. The table looked like a battlefield of paper. I had turned my grief into order, but something still nagged at me. Every document I had found had one thing in common: the same notary seal, the same date, the same office. Too perfect. The next morning, I visited the registration office again. The clerk who had helped me before recognized me and gave a polite nod. I asked about the notary. He hesitated, then leaned forward and said quietly, "That seal has been reported missing for over a year." The floor beneath me tilted. Missing. That meant every document they had produced was not only forged, it was illegal in a way that would carry criminal weight. I left the office and sat in my car for several minutes, letting the air settle. My pulse steadied. Then I called my attorney and told her everything. She said to keep silent about this discovery until she filed the motion. I agreed. The trap they built was about to become a cage. But before the next hearing, something happened that reminded me how far they were willing to go. Late that evening, the lights flickered. Then the power went out completely. I stepped outside and saw no outage on the street. Every other house glowed warm except mine. I walked around the perimeter, flashlight steady, breath controlled. At the back gate, the lock hung broken, a small sign of intrusion. Inside, nothing was missing. Nothing except a folder that had been on the desk, the one with the printed messages. Whoever had come knew exactly what to take. I called the police. They came, wrote their report, promised to follow up. I watched them drive away knowing the file would probably vanish into another file. But that did not bother me. I had learned to copy everything twice. The original messages were gone, but the digital versions sat safe elsewhere. 2 days later, a call came from an unknown number. The voice was calm, almost kind. "You can end this now," it said. "Withdraw, and we will leave you in peace." I let the silence stretch until the voice asked, "Do you understand?" I said, "Completely." Then I hung up. That was the moment I realized something important. Peace offered by those who break you is not peace, it is surrender. The next hearing came faster than expected. The courtroom was packed this time. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation. Reporters had started to notice the case, though they still did not know the full story. My attorney placed the forged documents before the judge, side by side with the examiner's report. She spoke with calm precision. Every point she made was a cut. Their lawyer tried to object, but each objection died against hard evidence. When the judge read the examiner's conclusion aloud, "Signature does not match the authentic specimen," the room changed. The sound of paper turning, the faint coughs, the shifting seats, it all faded. What remained was the sound of defeat beginning to whisper in their direction. Then came the counterattack. Their lawyer claimed the examiner's analysis was biased. He said I had fabricated the recordings. He requested time to bring in his own expert. The judge allowed it but added that the house would remain legally frozen and that law enforcement would investigate the missing notary seal. As I stood outside afterward, one of them approached me. Not the lawyer, but the person who had once called me family. Their voice shook with anger disguised as sorrow. "You could have handled this quietly," they said. I looked at them and replied, "Quietly is how thieves work." They turned away, muttering something about regret, but I knew there was no regret in them, only fear. That night, I did not sleep. I could not. My mind replayed every year that had led here. Every dinner, every smile, every promise. Betrayal does not arrive in one day. It is built in moments of trust. I realized I had been living in a story they wrote for me. Now I was writing my own. I began drafting a statement to file with the court, a detailed timeline of every manipulation, every falsehood, every emotional attack. I wrote without stopping, each sentence a wound closing. In the middle of the night, I paused to look around the room. The house looked different now, not like a place under siege, but like a fortress made of memory and endurance. I realized something that made my chest tighten. I had been trying to save the house because I thought it defined me. But in truth, fighting for it had revealed who I really was. The next morning, I received confirmation from my attorney that law enforcement had taken custody of the notary files. The investigation had become criminal. She said this would change everything. I thanked her and ended the call. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a small smile. As I walked through the garden, the wind moved through the leaves, soft and calm. I whispered to the air, "They wanted to bury me. They did not know I was a root." The war was far from over, but the balance had shifted. I no longer felt hunted. I felt prepared. What they had taken from me, trust, peace, certainty, had become the very tools I would use to finish this. They had built their story on lies. I was building mine on truth. And truth, once awakened, never goes back to sleep. Once the criminal investigation began, everything around me slowed down, but not from peace. It was the silence before another storm. They had gone quiet, but silence is not absence. It is preparation. My attorney said the best defense was not more words, but more proof. She told me to document everything, to build a wall of evidence so high that even their lies would collapse under their own weight. So that is what I did. Every morning, I woke before dawn and wrote. I wrote letters, statements, and timelines. I kept copies in 3 different places, one in my lawyer's office, one in a safety box, and one hidden where no one would ever think to look. I had learned the hard way that paper remembers better than people. I started reaching out to people I had lost touch with, neighbors, old co-workers, even the clerk who used to manage my bills. One by one, they began to recall moments that now carried new meaning. Someone remembered a suspicious call asking about my signature verification. Another recalled seeing my relative visit the property office multiple times alone. A pattern formed, clear, deliberate, undeniable. The case was not just about a house anymore. It had become a mirror reflecting greed, deceit, and the slow death of conscience. But I knew better than to rely only on others. So, I turned to the one thing they had never expected, their own arrogance. People who think they are smarter than everyone else always leave traces. They boast, they overshare, they underestimate. I started listening, not for words, but for slips. I created a small recorder, hidden inside an old clock in the living room, the same room where they had once tried to corner me with fake papers. I knew they would come again, pretending to negotiate, pretending to reconcile. And they did. One afternoon, the person who had betrayed me the deepest returned. They sat at the same table, pretending to seek peace. They said the investigation was ruining their reputation, that I should withdraw the complaint, for the family. I let them speak, let them dig their own hole with every sentence. They said, the money was meant for all of us. You just took it personally. I replied, calm and steady, when you steal from trust, you steal from everyone. They sighed, feigned guilt, and reached across the table, whispering, if we end this now, no one has to know who forged what. That was it. The confession I had been waiting for. The clock ticked quietly, catching every word. After they left, I copied the file to my attorney. She said it was the missing piece. Direct verbal acknowledgement. The law had a term for it, admission. Days later, I received a message from the court confirming that the new evidence had been added to the record. I felt something shift inside me. For the first time since this began, the truth had weighed on my side of the scale. But victory, even partial, makes enemies reckless. They started showing their panic in strange ways. Late-night calls filled with silence. Letters with no return address. A car idling outside the gate at odd hours. Fear tried to sneak back into my bones, but I refused to give it room. Fear is like mold. It grows where light is absent. So, I kept the lights on, both in the house and in my heart. A week later, I met with the investigator assigned to the case. He was a quiet man, methodical, and direct. He said, they underestimated you. They thought age meant surrender. I said, they taught me patience. I am only using what they gave me. He smiled faintly and handed me a copy of the latest report. The forgery had been confirmed. Multiple hands, multiple attempts, one mastermind. I traced the lines of the report with my fingers. The name written there was one I had once said with love. Now it looked like poison on paper. The next court session was set for the following Monday. My attorney said we were entering the final stage, cross-examination. That is where truth and lies collide in public, and neither walks away unscarred. The night before, I could not sleep. I sat near the window, watching the city hum. Every light in every house told a story I would never know. Mine had become one of survival, of betrayal, of rebuilding. But beneath all that, there was still pain. Pain for what was lost, and what could never be restored. The next morning, the courtroom was full. The press had caught wind of the fraud charges. Faces I did not know turned to watch me as I entered. My betrayers sat on the opposite bench, stiff, unreadable, pretending calm. But their eyes betrayed them. They flickered with the same nervousness I had once felt. When the hearing began, my attorney presented the new evidence, the audio recording. As the sound filled the room, you could hear their voice clearly admitting to manipulation. There was no escape now. The lawyer on their side tried to object, but the judge waved it off. The evidence was admissible. The person who had once called me family dropped their gaze. Their hands clenched in their lap, trembling. For a moment, I almost pitied them. Almost. The judge called for recess. I stepped outside, breathing in the cold air. My attorney joined me. She said softly, you realize this case will set precedent. You have turned a private betrayal into a public reckoning. I nodded, though I had not sought fame or glory. I had only wanted truth. Yet, as I stood there, I felt something larger unfolding. This was not just about me. It was about every person who had ever been silenced by guilt, gaslighted by family, cornered by trust. That evening, I went home and sat in the quiet again. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt like an ally. The walls that had once absorbed whispers were now holding strength. I walked from room to room, touching the surfaces, remembering. The memories no longer hurt. They instructed. In the living room, I stopped by the clock that had recorded everything. Its ticking felt different now, steady, sure, rhythmic. I whispered, you heard what no one believed. You spoke when I could not. Outside, a storm was forming. Rain tapped the windows like fingers impatient for release. I let it fall. For the first time in years, the sound did not bring sadness. It brought clarity. I realized the truth about battles like this. They are not won by shouting louder. They are won by standing longer. And I was still standing. The next phase would not just clear my name, it would redefine what they had taken. They had tried to destroy me with lies, but in doing so, they had handed me the one thing I had never fully claimed before, power. I no longer wanted revenge. I wanted resolution. The kind that ends with silence, not from fear, but from peace. The courtroom had seen their faces. The law had heard their voices. Now it was time for justice to speak. And when it did, it would not whisper. It would echo. The morning of the showdown, the courthouse steps felt steeper than before. I held the railing, not for support, but to steady the storm inside me. Crowds gathered near the entrance. Faces I did not know watched with quiet curiosity. I kept my eyes on the door. I had lived months in the shadow of their lies. Today, those shadows would meet the light. Inside, the courtroom had a different tension. The judge's eyes held a colder focus. My attorney shuffled papers with the confidence of a person who trusts her work. Across the aisle, they sat rigid, trying to appear calm. Fear leaked through small cracks, tight jaws, tapping fingers, the way glances darted toward exits. The clerk called the case. The air shifted as we rose. My attorney began with the clean lines of truth, dates, signatures, transfers, the missing notary seal. The court officer placed a binder of exhibits on the judge's desk. My name on each tab looked both fragile and unbreakable. I had come to understand that truth does not shout. It stands. The judge turned to their side. Your evidence, he said. Their lawyer rose with a careful smile and presented an affidavit from a new expert who claimed my signatures were consistent. He spoke with polished ease, pointing to squiggles and strokes as though they were a language only he could read. My attorney listened, silent. When he finished, she stepped forward with the examiner who had reviewed the originals. Calmly, she asked a single question that parted the fog. Did you analyze the pressure points beneath the strokes? The expert blinked, then admitted that he had worked from scanned copies. The judge leaned back, unimpressed. My attorney's examiner then explained how pressure patterns tell a story that ink alone cannot. Authentic signatures carry breath. Forgeries carry tension. They tried to recover with a new angle, questioning my memory, my temperament, the small lapses that come with age. The lawyer referred to the neighbor's earlier testimony and hinted that I had become forgetful. My attorney waited and then asked the court to play the recording again. Their voices filled the room. The line I will never forget, if we end this now, no one has to know who forged what. Silence followed like a verdict without words. The judge asked for cross-examination. My attorney approached their side's key witness, the one I had once trusted with my deepest fears. She asked about the protective trust and who drafted it. The witness said it was offered in kindness. My attorney asked if the clause allowing emergency management required notification. The witness hesitated. The judge raised an eyebrow. My attorney slid forward the page with the clause highlighted. The witness said the intent was safety. My attorney did not argue. She asked the witness to read aloud the part that allowed control without consent. Words that once hid behind legal polish sounded sharp when spoken into open air. Then the judge asked the question that changed the day. Who arranged the notary? The witness looked toward the lawyer, then toward the floor. A family contact, they said. The judge pressed for a name. When it came out, the courtroom stirred, the same notary whose seal had been reported missing the year before. The judge's expression hardened. He asked for a recess and ordered the bailiff to retrieve the notary logs on record. During the break, I stepped into the hallway and stood by a window. Reporters hovered close, unsure if they should ask questions. I raised a hand gently to signal I would not speak. I did not want to feed the noise. I wanted the gavel, not the cameras. When we returned, the bailiff carried a thin folder. The judge read quickly, eyes narrowing. This seal was reported missing on March 10th, he said. Yet it appears on documents dated in May and June. He looked at their lawyer. Explain. The lawyer spoke in circles that led nowhere. The judge stopped him with a raised hand. You will answer directly. The lawyer swallowed and said the documents were processed by a third party. The judge replied, then the third party will answer to the court. My attorney did not smile. She stepped forward with the last piece. Your Honor, the bank officer who flagged the near transfer is present. The bailiff opened the side door. A man in a crisp shirt took the stand. He testified that someone had attempted to move funds tied to my property using a signature that failed the live match check. He detailed the time, the request, the exact verification question that had tripped the system. When he finished, the judge stared at the defense table for a long breath that felt like a year. Then came their move. They requested to call a medical witness. A doctor entered, claiming I was under stress-related cognitive decline. He used soft, clinical phrases and tried to pull my life into a diagnosis. My attorney did not cross-examine at first. She asked the judge to admit 3 letters written by me to financial institutions during the same period, each precise and dated, outlining steps to protect my accounts. The judge read them silently. The doctor's confidence flickered. My attorney then asked the doctor if he had ever met me. He admitted he had not. His opinion was based on hearsay. The judge dismissed the weight of his statement. I felt the ground tilt again, but now it tilted my way. I did not gloat. I breathed. The judge turned to me. Would you like to speak? He asked. I rose. My fingers found the edge of the table, not to hold me up, but to anchor my words. I am 55, I said. I have known loss and patience. I have known love used like a leash. I signed papers because I trusted the hands that placed them in front of me. Those hands used care as a mask. I am here because I choose not to be erased. No one moved. Even the clock seemed to pause. The judge nodded once and asked a final question to the defense. Will your client stipulate that they sought control through the trust instrument? Their lawyer hesitated. He asked for a moment. He turned and whispered to them. I watched their faces, anger, panic, calculation. Then the person who had hurt me most spoke without moving lips, only with eyes, and I understood the answer would be no. The judge sighed and set the next date for closing arguments. He continued the stay on any sale, transfer, or encumbrance. Then he added something new. Based on the evidence, the court is inclined to consider sanctions. The word hung in the air like a bell tolling from a distant tower. As we packed our files, a bailiff approached my attorney with a note. She read it, frowned, and handed it to me. A search warrant had been executed at an office associated with their lawyers, third party. Items seized included blank deed forms with my name typed in, and multiple notary stamps wrapped in cloth. I stared at the page until the letters steadied. Outside, clouds gathered over the city. The air smelled like rain about to break. I walked down the steps slowly. Reporters closed in this time. One asked if I felt vindicated. I said, I feel seen. Another asked what I hoped the outcome would be. I said, justice that does not need an audience. At home, I placed the day's documents on the kitchen table and stood for a long time without touching them. The house felt taller, as if the roof had lifted to hold more sky. I brewed tea and let the steam rise. I wanted quiet, and the house gave it to me. Night came with a soft wind. I sat by the window and watched the streetlights blink on one by one. My phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. You think this ends with court? It does not. Blood writes the last line. I read it twice, then saved it to the folder labeled threats. I locked my doors, checked the cameras, and sat back down. I understood the truth of people who live by control. When they begin to lose it, they reach for fear like a rope. I did not take the rope. I let it fall. In the quiet, my mind replayed the moment in court when their witness could not read her own script without exposure. That was the turn. Not the paperwork, not the stamps, not the seals, those mattered, but the turn was human. Lies always slow at the edges. Truth moves with steadier feet. I wrote a single line in my notebook before bed. The house stands because I stood first. I closed the cover and listened to the old clock in the living room. Its steady rhythm felt like a promise. Justice was close, but not complete. There was one thread still loose, one piece I had not pulled. I could feel it without seeing it. A name that had not yet surfaced. A corridor inside their plan that someone else had walked. I lay down with that thought and let sleep come carefully. Tomorrow I would pull that thread, and when it came loose, everything they built would fall in one motion. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The air felt still, the kind of quiet that arrives before a verdict when time holds its breath, waiting for something irreversible. I stood in the doorway of my room, looking out at the hall, the pictures, the faint smell of tea that still lingered from last night. I thought about how long I had been living like this, half in the present, half in the courtroom. The house had become both my shelter and my battlefield. The day was meant for closing arguments. My attorney said the evidence was strong enough to force a ruling in our favor, but I knew better than to expect mercy from people who had built their lives on deceit. They had one more move left. They always did. When I arrived at the courthouse, the halls were crowded again. Faces I recognized from earlier hearings stood at a distance, whispering, watching. My betrayers were already there. Their lawyer greeted me with a hollow politeness, but the cracks in his voice betrayed exhaustion. He had been fighting to defend the indefensible. As we took our seats, I noticed someone new at their table, a woman in a gray suit, carrying a thin folder. She did not look like a lawyer. She looked like someone who had come to deliver something. Her calmness bothered me. People who hold the final card often wear that same stillness. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoed like the beginning of a symphony no one wanted to hear. The defense began. Their lawyer spoke with forced confidence, trying to paint the entire ordeal as a misunderstanding, a family dispute, a paperwork mix-up, a matter of love turned sour. He spoke of shared decisions, mutual trust, and emotional miscommunication. His words were soft, but they crawled with manipulation. When he finished, the woman in gray stood. She handed him the folder, and he cleared his throat. Your Honor, he said, my clients have decided to present a new document in their defense. It proves there was no intent to defraud. My attorney rose immediately. Objection, she said. We have completed discovery. No new evidence can be introduced without notice. The judge looked over his glasses. Counsel, you are aware of the procedure. The lawyer nodded and said, we only received this document yesterday from an external source. It was not in our possession earlier. The judge hesitated, then allowed a brief inspection. My attorney took the folder, opened it, and froze. Her eyes narrowed. Then she looked up and said, Your Honor, this is another forgery. The judge motioned for the bailiff to bring it forward. He examined the signature, compared it with earlier files, and frowned. This signature does not match any verified specimen. The defense lawyer stammered. The woman in gray lowered her head, but I could see the faintest trace of a smirk. My attorney leaned toward me and whispered, "They are panicking." The judge turned to the woman. "Who are you?" She replied quietly, "An administrative consultant hired by the defendants to prepare financial summaries." "Did you prepare this document?" "Yes." "Did you witness the signing?" "No, Your Honor. I was told it had already been signed." "And who told you that?" She hesitated, then looked at the people sitting beside her. "Them." The judge leaned back in his chair. "Then I suggest you prepare to testify under oath." For a moment, the courtroom was silent. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the slow rhythm of my heartbeat. Then, without warning, one of them, someone who had not spoken throughout the entire case, stood up and shouted, "This has gone far enough." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Sit down or be removed." But they kept speaking, their voice breaking under the weight of months of denial. "You think this house is everything. You think you are a saint. But you ruined this family before we ever touched a single document." Every word echoed through the room like glass breaking. I looked at them and said calmly, "I ruined nothing. I just stopped letting you take." They glared at me, shaking, their face red with rage. The judge called for order again, and finally they sat, breathing hard, staring at the floor. When my attorney spoke, her voice was clear and steady. "Your Honor, the defense has demonstrated consistent deception, repeated forgery, and witness manipulation. Every piece of their narrative falls apart under its own weight. We ask for full restoration of property, reimbursement of costs, and criminal referral." The judge nodded slowly. He took off his glasses, placed them on the desk, and said, "I have heard enough." Everyone stood still. Even the air felt frozen. The evidence presented leaves no room for ambiguity. This court finds that the documents submitted by the defense were fraudulent. Property ownership is hereby reinstated in full to the plaintiff. My chest tightened. I gripped the edge of the table as if it could keep me from floating away. The judge continued, "Furthermore, given the deliberate nature of the deception, I am referring this matter for criminal prosecution." The words landed like thunder. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Their lawyer tried to speak, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "Counsel, I have heard enough excuses for one lifetime." The gavel struck once more. Case closed. I did not smile. I did not cry. I just stood there as the sound of the gavel faded into silence. They turned toward me. Some looked broken. Some looked empty. And one looked at me with something that almost resembled regret, but regret born from exposure, not remorse. As I walked out, the reporters closed in again. I said nothing. My silence was my statement. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds. I stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, feeling the warmth on my face. The world looked sharper, cleaner. Not because it had changed, but because I had. I thought back to the first day I received that notice, the day everything began. The same city, the same streets, but a different person. That version of me would have begged, would have cried, would have asked for understanding. This version of me simply walked forward. When I reached home, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and rain. The light fell across the wooden floor, soft and golden. For the first time, the house did not feel like evidence. It felt like belonging. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The same trees, the same sky, but everything looked new. I whispered, "You are still mine." That night, as I sat at the kitchen table, I thought about everything the fight had taken from me: sleep, peace, trust. But I also thought about what it had given: clarity, strength, and the courage to speak when silence had once been my prison. The phone rang once. I let it. I did not need to answer anymore. The war was over. But as I turned off the lights, I caught my reflection in the window, older, sharper, steadier. Justice had been served, but something deeper had shifted. I was no longer the person who waited for rescue. I had become the person who refused to be erased. I whispered to my reflection, "They tried to take my house. But what I did next stunned everyone." Then I smiled, not in victory, but in peace. The kind of peace that is earned, not given. The morning after the verdict, the world felt strange in its simplicity. No summons, no calls from lawyers, no new threats disguised as concern. Only quiet. I made tea and watched the sunlight creep across the kitchen table, the same table where they had once placed the papers meant to end me. I traced the faint scratch on its surface with my fingertip. It felt like a scar, visible, permanent, but no longer painful. People often imagine victory as celebration. They think justice comes with noise, applause, or relief that washes away everything that came before. They do not see what happens afterward. Justice does not heal you. It introduces you to yourself. For the first time in months, I walked through every room of the house without looking over my shoulder. Each room carried its own ghosts, but they no longer whispered. The walls that had once felt heavy with betrayal now breathed again. I stood in the living room and listened to the steady rhythm of the old clock, the same clock that had recorded their confession. Its ticking sounded like life returning to normal, yet I knew normal was gone. Something better had replaced it. The house did not look like victory. It looked like truth. There were stains that could never be cleaned, memories that could never be forgotten. But I did not want to erase them anymore. They were proof that I had survived, that I had rebuilt from the ashes of trust. Later that day, my attorney called. Her voice was calm, almost relieved. She said the criminal investigation had moved forward. Charges were being filed. She asked if I wanted to attend the next hearing. I said, no, I do not need to see them punished. The court has already done what I could not. Now I want peace. She paused before saying, you know, most people break when the people closest to them turn. You did not. I smiled faintly and said, I did. I just rebuilt differently. When the call ended, I sat for a long time in silence. The idea of rebuilding stayed with me. Not the house, I had fought for that and won, but myself. I thought about who I was before all this began, trusting, patient, eager to please. I thought about how easily I had mistaken peace for silence, love for obedience, family for loyalty. I had lived half my life believing that kindness meant surrender. It took betrayal to teach me the difference. That evening, I opened the old notebook where I had written everything, the notes, the evidence, the fragments of memory I had used to hold on to the truth when everyone around me insisted it was gone. I turned to the last blank page and wrote, this was not a story about a house. It was a story about ownership of self. I closed the notebook, tied it with a string, and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Some stories do not need an audience, they only need to be remembered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stepped outside. The air smelled of damp soil and jasmine from the garden. The trees I had planted decades ago stood taller now. I remembered the night I thought I would lose everything, the night I stood by this same window, whispering that they could not take this from me. I had been right. They had tried to take the house, but the real theft had always been something deeper, the attempt to rewrite who I was. Now, standing beneath the same sky, I felt no anger, only understanding. Some battles end not because the enemy surrenders, but because you outgrow the war. Neighbors began to speak to me again. Some offered quiet congratulations, others offered apologies for believing the rumors. I accepted both with the same nod. The truth did not need to be defended anymore. It had defended itself. One evening, a letter arrived. No name, no address, only 2 words written in handwriting I recognized instantly. I'm sorry. I held it for a while, then folded it once and placed it under a book. I did not throw it away. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing not to let someone else's weakness define your peace. Weeks passed. The investigators finished their work. The courts filed their sentences. The news moved on. Life became quiet again. But I was not the same. I had learned that calm without clarity is a trap. Now, every quiet moment felt earned. I began volunteering at a legal aid center, helping others who had faced deception from those closest to them. I sat with people who trembled the way I once did, voices shaking, eyes lost between disbelief and hope. I told them what someone once told me, greed leaves fingerprints, so does courage. Some listened, some cried, all understood. At home, the house became warm again. I repainted the front door. I replaced the lock on the back gate. I repaired the garden bench. Every act felt like writing a new sentence in a language that only I could read. One night, I found myself sitting by the old clock again. Its ticking filled the silence. I thought of every moment that had tried to break me, the letter that started it, the courtroom that tested me, the betrayals that almost ended me. And I realized something simple yet powerful. Every wound they gave me became a window I learned to see through. I whispered to the empty room, they tried to take my house. But what they really gave me was a reason to build a stronger home inside myself. I stood, turned off the lights, and walked down the hall. The walls glowed faintly in the moonlight. For once, I did not look back. As I reached the doorway, I paused. I thought about all the people who live quietly while someone chips away at their dignity, one signature, one insult, one manipulation at a time. People who convince themselves it is easier to stay silent. I wanted to tell them what I had learned, what the whole fight had taught me, not in anger, but in truth. When they try to take what is yours, do not fight with rage. Fight with clarity. Rage burns fast. Clarity endures. The house taught me that. The law confirmed it. And time sealed it. Now, when I walk through these rooms, I do not see betrayal. I see the proof of endurance. Walls that stayed, a heart that did not fold, a name that remained mine. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear echoes of the past, the knock on the door, the whisper of false concern, the shuffle of papers meant to erase me. But those sounds no longer scare me. They remind me who I became because of them. They thought they were writing my ending. They were only writing my beginning. And if anyone ever asks what happened, I will tell them this: they tried to take my house. But what I did next stunned everyone. Then I will smile, not because I won, but because I endured. And endurance, I have learned, is louder than victory.